The cafeteria at Alcatraz was never truly quiet, even during meals when conversation was supposed to be minimal, because beneath the scrape of metal trays and the dull echo of boots on concrete, there was always something else lingering, something tense and watchful, the unspoken understanding that violence could erupt at any moment without warning. And on this particular October afternoon in 1959, that tension felt heavier than usual, thicker in the air, as if the room itself sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. A massive white inmate leaned forward at one of the long tables, his size commanding attention even before he spoke, and when the racial slur left his mouth, it didn't just insult the man across from him. It rippled outward, drawing the attention of nearby tables, freezing a few hands mid-bite, making several inmates glance up just long enough to register danger and then quickly look away again. Sitting directly across from him was an older black man with a calm posture and a composed expression, his prison shirt neatly tucked, his movements unhurried, and when the insult was thrown at him, he didn't react the way most men in that room would have. He didn't stiffen, didn't clench his jaw, didn't rise to defend his name or his dignity. He simply continued eating as though nothing had been said at all. For a moment, the lack of response was more unsettling than any shout or threat could have been, because in a place like Alcatraz, silence could mean fear, but it could also mean something far more dangerous, and the bully mistook it for the former, assuming that size, reputation, and years of unchecked intimidation had once again done their job. The older man eventually looked up, slowly, deliberately, and when his eyes met his tormentors, he smiled, not with warmth, not with humor, but with a quiet certainty that suggested understanding rather than submission. The kind of smile that unsettles men who believe violence is only about strength and volume. Around them, the cafeteria continued its rigid routine. Guards remained at their posts, and no one intervened, because moments like this happened all the time and were rarely worth attention unless fists started flying. What no one in that room realized was that the smile was not an act of restraint. It was a signal that a line had already been crossed, and that what followed would not be impulsive or chaotic, but precise, intentional, and final. In less time than it takes to draw a breath, that calm would shatter, blood would spill across the cafeteria floor, whistles would pierce the air, and the man who believed himself untouchable would be screaming in agony, his face ruined and his world permanently altered. 3 seconds would be all it took. 2 calculated cuts delivered with surgical speed, and one eye would be lost forever. Not in a fair fight, not in mutual combat, but as the inevitable conclusion of a strategy that had been quietly unfolding while everyone else mistook patience for weakness. This was not a story about rage boiling over or a man snapping under pressure, but about how violence inside prison walls is often decided long before the first blow is struck, shaped by power, racism, and the failure of authority to protect the vulnerable. To understand why that smile mattered and why it became legendary, you have to understand who that man was, what he had already endured, and how intelligence and timing can turn 3 seconds into a lesson that echoes for decades. In 1959, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary operated with a precision that felt almost inhuman, a place where every day followed the same unforgiving rhythm, where inmates woke to the clang of metal doors, stood for count, moved in silent lines, ate at assigned times, and returned to concrete cells surrounded by cold, dark water that made the idea of escape feel like a cruel joke rather than a possibility. And that unchanging routine was not meant to rehabilitate, but to exhaust, to wear men down psychologically until time itself became an enemy. The isolation was relentless, because Alcatraz didn't just separate prisoners from society, it separated them from hope, from distraction, from any sense that tomorrow might be different from today. And over months and years, that kind of confinement created a pressure that didn't explode outward right away, but instead settled deep in the mind, where resentment, fear, and suppressed anger slowly fermented. Violence inside Alcatraz was surprisingly rare, not because the men there were peaceful, but because the consequences were so severe that most inmates learned to restrain themselves, knowing that one reckless act could mean weeks or months in solitary confinement, locked alone in a dark cell with nothing but your thoughts. And so aggression was usually expressed in quieter ways, through stares held too long, words spoken just softly enough to avoid discipline, and calculated acts of humiliation designed to assert dominance without crossing a visible line. When violence did erupt, however, it was never spontaneous or small, because by the time a man decided to strike, the decision had already been made in his head long before the first blow, and the result was usually catastrophic, remembered for years, whispered about in cell blocks, and absorbed into the prison's unwritten law. Guards, though armed and officially in control, did not truly govern every interaction because their authority was selective, shaped by bias, fatigue, and convenience. And while they enforced schedules and punished obvious rule breaking, they often ignored the slow, corrosive forms of intimidation that didn't leave immediate blood on the floor, especially when those actions targeted inmates they subconsciously viewed as lesser or expendable. This imbalance created a dangerous environment where bullies learned exactly how far they could go without consequence, while victims learned that reporting abuse only painted a target on their backs, making reputation and self-enforced justice the only real currency of survival. The cafeteria was where all of this came together, because it was the one place where nearly every inmate was forced into close proximity, where guards watched from the edges instead of standing between men, and where any insult or act of disrespect was witnessed by dozens of eyes, making it public, unforgettable, and impossible to ignore. In a prison built on silence and restraint, the cafeteria was the stage where power was tested, where dominance was displayed, and where, on rare occasions, the tension that had been building quietly for weeks or years finally snapped in a moment that no one inside those walls would ever forget. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not just another inmate at Alcatraz, and long before he ever stepped onto the rock, he had already lived several lifetimes in the most violent corners of American organized crime, rising from the streets of Harlem to become a power broker whose influence stretched across gambling, numbers rackets, and alliances that crossed racial lines at a time when most criminal empires were rigidly segregated, and that history followed him into prison whether guards acknowledged it or not. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson had survived decades of gang wars, not by being the loudest or the most brutal man in the room, but by being the most calculating, understanding that violence was a tool rather than an impulse, and that it worked best when used sparingly, decisively, and with a clear objective. He had stood toe-to-toe with Italian mob figures, negotiated rather than postured, and learned early that men who relied only on fear eventually lost control, while men who mixed respect, intelligence, and selective brutality built loyalty that endured. That reputation mattered inside prison because inmates recognized the difference between men who talked about violence and men who had already lived through it, and Bumpy carried himself with a calm authority that suggested he had nothing left to prove. He followed a personal code of conduct that was widely understood among those who knew him, a code that valued dignity, patience, and protection of those who couldn't protect themselves, and while he was fully capable of extreme violence, he did not use it to dominate the weak or inflate his ego, reserving it instead for moments when a lesson had to be taught and disorder had to be permanently corrected. This approach earned him respect across racial lines because even white inmates who might never have allied themselves with a black crime boss could recognize discipline when they saw it, and they understood that Bumpy was not reckless, not emotional, and not easily provoked, qualities that made him far more dangerous than younger men who relied on constant intimidation. Among black inmates in particular, Bumpy represented something rare inside the federal prison system, a figure who embodied power without chaos, who had succeeded in a criminal world dominated by white organizations, and who refused to degrade himself even in captivity, maintaining manners, restraint, and a quiet pride that others gravitated toward instinctively. He did not seek confrontation, did not bully, and did not insert himself into conflicts unnecessarily, but when he spoke, people listened because his words carried the weight of experience and survival rather than bravado. The key difference between Bumpy Johnson and most violent inmates was his understanding of timing, because loud violence was easy, impulsive, and often punished harshly, while strategic violence required patience, observation, and the willingness to endure temporary humiliation in order to achieve a permanent outcome. Bumpy understood that prison, like the streets, operated on unwritten rules, and that the most effective way to change behavior was not through constant aggression, but through one decisive act that made further challenges unthinkable. This mindset followed him into Alcatraz, where many initially mistook his age and calm demeanor for weakness, not realizing that the man they were watching had already survived more violence than most of them ever would, and that beneath his quiet exterior was a strategist who knew exactly when to wait, when to act, and how to end a threat in a way that would never need repeating. Eric Pollson was the kind of man the federal prison system claimed Alcatraz was built to contain, a man whose physical presence alone felt like a threat. Standing over 6 feet tall, weighing close to 275 pounds, his body hardened through years of violence and relentless prison weightlifting, moving with the confidence of someone who had learned early that size could silence resistance before words were ever exchanged. And that belief shaped every interaction he had with other inmates. Long before his arrival on the Rock, Pollson had already established himself as a predator, convicted of 3 separate murders committed during armed robberies in Texas in the mid-1950s, all of them black men. And what distinguished him from other killers was not just the brutality of his crimes, but the way he openly celebrated them, showing no remorse, no hesitation, and no attempt to soften his hatred when he stood before a judge. In court, Pollson made his ideology unmistakably clear, using racist language without apology, laughing during sentencing, and declaring that killing black men was not real murder, but something he viewed as justified, necessary, and even virtuous, statements so extreme that they shocked even hardened legal professionals and marked him as a man driven not just by greed or anger, but by an obsession with racial dominance. That same ideology followed him into prison, where violence became more than a means of survival and instead transformed into a source of pleasure, because intimidation allowed Pollson to relive the power he had felt on the outside, dominating others in an environment where reputation often mattered more than formal authority. Inside Alcatraz, Pollson learned quickly that outright attacks brought consequences, but subtle terror did not, and he adapted with precision, using calculated humiliation, whispered slurs, stolen food, and carefully timed physical contact that could always be explained away as accidental, allowing him to inflict fear without triggering immediate punishment. He enjoyed this form of control because it reminded him that even in captivity, he could still dictate how others felt, where they stood, and whether they walked with confidence or with their eyes lowered. And over time, that sense of dominance became addictive. Guards, for their part, tolerated Pollson far longer than they should have, not because they were unaware of his behavior, but because his actions existed in the gray areas of enforcement, rarely dramatic enough to demand intervention, and sometimes quietly aligned with the prejudices of the men tasked with maintaining order. Some guards saw Pollson as useful, a man whose presence kept certain inmates fearful and compliant, while others simply didn't care enough to challenge behavior that didn't disrupt schedules or create paperwork, and so his reputation grew unchecked. Pollson interpreted this tolerance as validation, proof that the system itself agreed with his view of hierarchy, and with every insult ignored and every complaint dismissed, his confidence hardened into arrogance. By the time he crossed paths with an older black inmate who refused to respond the way Pollson expected, he had spent years believing himself untouchable, protected by his size, his reputation, and a prison culture that had allowed his hatred to flourish beneath the surface of routine. What Pollson never understood was that intimidation only works until it meets someone who is willing to endure it patiently, observe it carefully, and then end it in a way that leaves no room for misunderstanding, and that miscalculation would soon cost him far more than his sense of control ever gave him. Racism inside prison rarely announced itself through open violence, because the most effective form of terror was psychological, subtle enough to avoid punishment, yet constant enough to wear men down day after day. And inmates like Pollson understood this better than anyone, using slurs not just as insults, but as reminders of power, hierarchy, and vulnerability in a place where dignity was already fragile. Food theft was one of the simplest tactics, because taking something from a man's tray in the cafeteria wasn't just about hunger, it was about humiliation, about showing everyone nearby that the victim could be violated in public without consequence. And when that act went unanswered, it sent a message that resistance was either impossible or too dangerous to attempt. Whispers were even more effective. Racial slurs spoken just quietly enough to avoid a guard's attention, words delivered close to the ear in showers, corridors, or stairwells, moments where there were no witnesses willing to speak and no evidence that could be written into a report. Physical intimidation followed the same pattern: bumps in narrow hallways, shoulders driven hard enough to hurt but not hard enough to leave marks, shoves disguised as accidents on wet shower floors, all carefully calibrated to provoke fear without triggering discipline. Reporting this behavior almost never worked, because prison systems relied on visible violations, not patterns of abuse, and inmates who complained quickly earned reputations as troublemakers or informants, labels that made them even more vulnerable to retaliation. Guards, overwhelmed, indifferent, or biased, often dismissed complaints as exaggeration or interpersonal conflict, and in some cases quietly agreed with the hierarchy being enforced, believing that fear kept order more effectively than fairness ever could. This created an environment where racism became a tool of control, allowing certain inmates to dominate others without lifting a fist, shaping behavior through constant reminders of inferiority, forcing victims to choose between silence and escalation, both of which carried risks. Over time, this form of control reshaped prison life, determining where men sat, how they walked, when they spoke, and whether they felt safe enough to look another inmate in the eye. And those who mastered it learned they could rule spaces without ever being formally in charge. The danger of this system was not just the harm it inflicted on individuals, but the way it encouraged bullies to believe they were untouchable, protected by both their reputation and institutional neglect. And when that belief took root, it pushed them further, escalating their behavior until intimidation turned into entitlement. In that sense, racism inside prison was not just hatred, it was a mechanism, a method of governance enforced from the bottom up. And like all systems built on fear, it remained stable only until someone decided to break it decisively, publicly, and in a way that made returning to the old order impossible. Eric Pollson's fixation on Bumpy Johnson was not random, emotional, or impulsive, but rooted deeply in an obsession with hierarchy that defined how Pollson understood the world. Because to him, prison was not just a place of confinement, but a battlefield where dominance had to be constantly asserted, reinforced, and made visible, and anyone who disrupted that order became an intolerable threat. Pollson believed absolutely in a racial and physical ranking system where white men sat at the top, strength equaled worth, and fear was proof of superiority. And within that distorted framework, the respect Bumpy Johnson commanded inside Alcatraz was not merely irritating, it was an affront to everything Pollson believed about power. Bumpy was older, smaller, and quieter, Yet inmates across racial lines deferred to him, listened when he spoke, and treated him with a level of dignity that Pollson felt should have been reserved only for men like himself. And that contradiction gnawed at him because it undermined the idea that dominance could be enforced solely through intimidation and size. To Pollson, seeing black inmates look to Bumpy Johnson for guidance and protection felt like watching the natural order collapse, and every calm gesture, every measured word, every moment of unchallenged respect made Pollson feel smaller despite his physical advantage. His hatred was not just racial, but symbolic, because Bumpy represented a version of black power that Pollson could not dismiss as weakness or chaos. A man who had succeeded in a criminal world dominated by white organizations and who carried himself with confidence, even inside a prison designed to strip men of identity. That kind of respect was intolerable to Pollson because it wasn't granted through fear, and fear was the only language Pollson believed in. So he decided that Bumpy had to be publicly humiliated, broken down in front of others, and reduced to what Pollson believed his proper place should be. The goal was never just to insult Bumpy in private, but to strip him of standing in communal spaces like the cafeteria, the showers, and the yard, where witnesses mattered and humiliation carried weight beyond the moment itself. Pollson understood that public dominance was the currency of prison life, and by targeting Bumpy openly, he hoped to send a message not only to him, but to every black inmate watching, reinforcing the idea that respect could be revoked at any time by force. Each act of provocation was designed to test boundaries, to see whether Bumpy would react impulsively and give guards a reason to punish him, or submit and confirm Pollson's worldview. And every time Bumpy walked away, Pollson mistook discipline for defeat and restraint for fear. That misinterpretation fueled Pollson's confidence, encouraging him to escalate further because bullies thrive on the illusion that silence equals weakness. And Pollson had spent years conditioning himself to believe that anyone who did not immediately fight back was beneath him. What Pollson never grasped was that Bumpy's refusal to respond was not acceptance of hierarchy, but rejection of it, a deliberate refusal to play a game where strength alone dictated outcomes. And that refusal made Pollson more desperate to assert control. By the time Pollson began directing his attacks, not just at Bumpy, but at younger, more vulnerable black inmates under Bumpy's informal protection, the conflict was no longer about ego or dominance. It had become about dismantling a figure who symbolized dignity in a system designed to erase it. In trying to publicly humiliate Bumpy Johnson, Pollson believed he was reinforcing order, when in reality he was dismantling his own protection, step by step, provoking a man who understood that true power in prison did not come from constant aggression, but from choosing the exact moment when violence would speak louder than any insult ever could. The first provocation unfolded in a way that seemed almost insignificant on the surface, the kind of small act that happened dozens of times a day inside Alcatraz. Yet everyone who witnessed it understood immediately that something dangerous had just begun, because it took place in the cafeteria, the most public space in the prison, where disrespect was never accidental and humiliation was always deliberate. It was Friday, October 16, 1959, lunchtime, and inmates were seated at long wooden tables eating in near silence, when Eric Pollson walked past the table where Bumpy Johnson sat with 3 other black inmates, and without breaking his stride, without looking down, without asking, Pollson reached out and lifted the small piece of apple pie from Bumpy's tray, the dessert that marked the end of the meal, and carried it away as casually as if it had always belonged to him. There was no confrontation, no sudden movement, just Pollson sitting down at his own table and eating the pie slowly, while staring back at Bumpy with open contempt, making sure the insult was not only felt but seen. Around Bumpy's table, muscles tightened, hands paused midair, and several inmates instinctively shifted in their seats, prepared to stand, because in prison culture, allowing food to be taken was a public declaration of weakness, a signal that a man could be violated without consequence. Everyone expected Bumpy to react, because reacting was what survival demanded, and the longer he stayed seated, the more uncomfortable the silence became, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then Bumpy looked down at the empty space on his tray, glanced briefly toward Pollson, chewing his stolen dessert, and returned to eating the rest of his meal without a word, without a glare, without even a visible tightening of his jaw. The decision stunned the men around him, because to them it looked like submission, the kind of quiet defeat that erased reputations and invited further abuse, and a few inmates later admitted they wondered if age had finally caught up with him, if the stories about Harlem were just stories after all. What they didn't understand in that moment was that Bumpy had already calculated the cost of reacting, because striking Pollson over a piece of pie would have made Bumpy the aggressor, sent him straight to solitary confinement, and ended any moral advantage he might later need. By doing nothing, Bumpy forced Pollson to reveal his intent, because the theft was no longer about hunger or impulse. It was clearly about disrespect, about testing how far Pollson could go in front of witnesses and guards without consequences. The guards noticed the interaction but did nothing, because no rule had technically been broken, and that silence from authority told Pollson exactly what he needed to know, that he could push further and still remain protected by the system. As Pollson finished the pie, savoring it slowly, his confidence grew, reinforced by the lack of resistance, and the message spread quietly through the cafeteria that the older black man who carried so much reputation had allowed himself to be disrespected publicly. For Bumpy, that moment marked the beginning of a psychological setup, because by absorbing the insult without reacting, he allowed Pollson to misread him completely, to believe that fear had replaced resolve, and that belief would become Pollson's greatest weakness. The stolen apple pie was not the insult itself, but the opening move, the bait that began a chain of escalating provocations, each one pushing closer to a line that Bumpy had already identified, a line Pollson would inevitably cross once he became confident enough to believe there would never be consequences. The second provocation came days later in one of the most vulnerable places inside Alcatraz, the communal shower room, where men stood half naked on slick concrete floors with steam in the air, guards distant, and respect enforced not by rules but by reputation. And it was here that Eric Pollson chose to turn psychological harassment into physical contact. Bumpy Johnson was already showering when Pollson entered, scanning the room, even though several open shower heads were available. And instead of choosing any of them, he walked directly toward Bumpy, closing the distance slowly, deliberately, making sure witnesses were close enough to see, but not close enough to intervene. Without warning, Pollson shoved him hard in the chest, the kind of force that carried extra danger on wet concrete, sending Bumpy stumbling sideways and forcing him to brace against the wall to keep from falling, a move that could have easily resulted in serious injury if he had gone down wrong. As water continued to run and heads turned, Pollson claimed the space with his voice, using a racial slur loud enough to carry through the room, declaring that the shower belonged to him and that Bumpy needed to move, framing the assault as both physical dominance and racial entitlement. For a moment, time seemed to slow, because this was no longer subtle, no longer ambiguous, and everyone watching understood that a line had been crossed, that any response from Bumpy would be justified in the eyes of other inmates, even if not in the eyes of the guards. Bumpy straightened himself slowly, water dripping from his shoulders, and looked directly at Pollson without anger or fear, holding eye contact just long enough to register the insult fully. And then, without speaking, without gesturing, he stepped away and took another open shower several feet down the line. To Pollson, the decision looked like confirmation of everything he believed, that the older man lacked the will to fight, that reputation meant nothing once pressure was applied, and that his size and aggression had once again forced submission. What Pollson failed to understand was that walking away in that moment was not retreat, but preservation, because responding violently in the shower would have ensured witnesses, blood, and immediate punishment, stripping Bumpy of any future claim to self-defense and giving Pollson exactly what he wanted, a reaction he could use to justify further escalation. By refusing to react publicly, Bumpy maintained control of the narrative, forcing Pollson to escalate again if he wanted dominance, and that escalation would have to be even more blatant, even more visible, and harder for authorities to ignore. The shove in the shower inflated Pollson's confidence, convincing him that he could now touch Bumpy physically without consequence, that the rules did not apply to him, and that the older man's silence was proof of weakness rather than strategy. Each step Pollson took deeper into that belief made him louder, bolder, and less careful. And while he felt himself rising in power, he was unknowingly moving closer to the exact moment Bumpy had been waiting for, the moment when walking away would no longer protect anyone else, and when violence would no longer be optional but necessary. The third provocation took place in the prison yard, a wide-open space where movement was limited. Paths were informal but respected, and status was displayed not through words, but through who stepped aside for whom. And when Eric Pollson deliberately blocked Bumpy Johnson's path that afternoon, everyone nearby understood immediately that this was no accident and no misunderstanding, but a demand for submission made as publicly as possible. Pollson planted himself directly in front of Bumpy, forcing him to stop, and with other inmates close enough to hear and see, he issued the order plainly, telling Bumpy to walk around him, reinforcing the message with a racial slur and a declaration that white men walked straight, while black men stepped aside, turning the simple act of walking into a public test of dominance. For several seconds, the yard felt suspended because this was the kind of moment that defined reputations, and inmates nearby slowed their steps, pretending not to stare while committing every detail to memory, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after recreation ended. Bumpy paused, looked at Pollson without visible emotion, and then stepped off the path and walked around him, not hurriedly, not defiantly, but calmly, choosing to yield the space in full view of everyone watching. Pollson laughed loudly, calling after him, repeating the slur, mocking the act as proof that Bumpy knew his place, and that laughter echoed across the yard like an announcement, inviting others to see what he believed was a complete humiliation. In that moment, Pollson believed he had won because public submission was currency inside prison, and he had forced it from a man whose reputation had previously commanded respect. But the reaction around them told a more complicated story. Some inmates shook their heads, convinced Bumpy had finally been broken, whispering that age had dulled him and that his Harlem legend no longer carried weight on the rock, while others, particularly older inmates and those who understood prison politics, exchanged quiet looks, sensing that no man with Bumpy's history would endure such humiliation without reason. By that evening, the rumor mill was in full motion, stories traveling faster than guards ever could, retold with exaggeration, speculation, and prediction. Some claiming Pollson had exposed Bumpy as weak, others insisting that no one endured that level of disrespect unless they were setting a trap. Two camps formed quickly, one that believed Pollson had asserted permanent dominance, and another that believed he had crossed a line so publicly that retaliation was now inevitable. And the tension between those interpretations sharpened the atmosphere inside the cell blocks. Pollson, emboldened by the laughter and the lack of immediate consequences, grew more confident, mistaking divided opinion for support and silence for approval, while Bumpy said nothing, offering no explanation, allowing both narratives to exist unchecked. That silence only deepened the mystery, because in a place where men defended themselves loudly, restraint stood out as something deliberate, something dangerous. And as word spread through Alcatraz that Pollson had forced Bumpy Johnson to step aside, many began to wonder not if there would be consequences, but when and how severe they would be when they finally arrived. Later that night, away from the noise of the yard and the eyes of the guards, Bumpy Johnson finally spoke about what everyone had been whispering, and when he did, it became clear that nothing Pollson had done so far had caught him off guard or shaken his control, because Bumpy understood prison not as a place ruled by impulse, but as a system governed by perception, timing, and justification. Sitting calmly among several black inmates in the cell block, men who were confused, angry, and worried that his silence was being mistaken for weakness, Bumpy explained in a low, steady voice that reacting too early was exactly what Pollson wanted, because a single punch thrown in anger would strip away context and turn the victim into the aggressor in the eyes of the institution. He reminded them that prison law and real law were not the same thing, because prison law cared less about who was right and more about who moved first, who created paperwork, and who disrupted routine. And under that system, the man who struck back too soon almost always paid the higher price. Bumpy made it clear that guards did not investigate patterns of harassment. They responded to visible violence, and that meant a man had to be patient enough to let provocation become undeniable, sustained, and witnessed by enough people that it could no longer be dismissed as mutual conflict. What he was waiting for, he explained, was the threshold, the point at which Pollson's behavior crossed from insult into threat, from harassment into imminent danger, not just to Bumpy himself, but to someone who could not defend themselves, because only then would a violent response be understood as necessary rather than emotional. This was why intelligence mattered more than strength, because strength alone tempted men to act immediately, to prove dominance in the moment, while intelligence allowed a man to absorb humiliation temporarily in order to win permanently. Bumpy told them that Pollson believed size made him untouchable, that he relied on fear and noise, and that men like that always grew careless once they believed they were safe because arrogance dulled awareness faster than age ever could. By walking away publicly, by allowing Pollson to think he had control, Bumpy was feeding that arrogance, giving him what he called rope, enough confidence to keep pushing, enough boldness to make his next move unavoidable and indefensible. He warned them that violence used at the wrong time solved nothing, but violence used at the exact right moment ended problems completely, because it changed how everyone in the prison recalculated risk. Strength, he said, could be neutralized, but patience disarmed opponents before the first blow was ever thrown, because it forced them to expose themselves repeatedly until there was no ambiguity left. The men listening began to understand that what looked like submission was actually positioning, that Bumpy was shaping the narrative long before the confrontation occurred, ensuring that when the moment finally came, witnesses would remember not just the act of violence, but everything that led up to it. He ended the conversation by telling them to stay calm, to let Pollson continue, and to watch carefully, because when a man believed himself immune to consequences, he inevitably crossed the one line that intelligence was waiting for. In that quiet cell block, the anger softened into understanding, because they realized that the strategy was not about pride or revenge, but about survival in a system where justice only existed when it could be proven beyond doubt, and where the smartest man was always the one who decided when the fight truly began. Robert Jackson was everything Eric Pollson preyed on: young, small, nonviolent, and visibly out of place in a prison built for men who survived through intimidation, a 23-year-old serving time for postal fraud rather than violence, someone whose posture and quiet habits marked him immediately as vulnerable in an environment that punished vulnerability without mercy. Jackson spent most of his time alone, reading when he could, keeping his head down, trying to serve his sentence without attracting attention, and that alone made him a target because in prisons like Alcatraz, solitude was often interpreted as weakness rather than caution. On the afternoon of October 22, 1959, Pollson approached Jackson during recreation, looming over him as he sat on a bench with a book in his hands. And when Pollson snatched the book away and mocked him with racial slurs, it wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration that Jackson had no protection and no right to dignity. Jackson tried to respond politely, asking for the book back, his voice calm, deferential, hoping compliance might diffuse the situation. But that response only confirmed Pollson's sense of dominance, because bullies interpret politeness as permission. Pollson struck him across the face with the book hard enough to knock him off the bench, sending him to the ground in front of other inmates, and then threw the book into a puddle of dirty water, reducing Jackson not just physically, but symbolically, as Pollson stood over him delivering more slurs and reminding him and everyone watching of where he believed Jackson belonged. Guards intervened only after the damage was done, separating the men but issuing Pollson little more than a verbal warning and a temporary loss of recreation privileges, a response so mild it might as well have been approval, while Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a black eye, carrying the visible evidence of a system that punished victims more thoroughly than aggressors. That failure was the moment everything changed, because until then, Bumpy Johnson had been absorbing insults aimed at himself, calculating, waiting. But now Pollson's behavior had crossed the line Bumpy had been watching for, moving from personal harassment into open violence against someone who could not defend himself. That evening in the cell block, Bumpy Johnson sat with other black inmates, his demeanor calm but his certainty unmistakable. And when he spoke, there was no anger in his voice, only finality, because the assault on Jackson confirmed what Bumpy already knew, that Pollson's confidence had grown into recklessness, and that the institution would not intervene until blood forced it to. Bumpy told them plainly that patience had served its purpose, that he had allowed Pollson to believe he was untouchable long enough, and that when a man began attacking the weak openly and without consequence, restraint became complicity. He made a promise that night, not shouted, not dramatic, but delivered with quiet resolve, that Pollson would learn a lesson he would never forget, and that no one under his informal protection would be touched again. For those listening, the room felt heavier, because they understood that the calculation was complete, that the threshold had been crossed, and that whatever happened next would not be spontaneous or chaotic, but deliberate, measured, and irreversible. The assault on Robert Jackson transformed the conflict from a contest of pride into a matter of moral necessity, because for Bumpy, violence was no longer about defending his own reputation. It was about stopping a predator the system had allowed to roam freely, and once that line was crossed, there was no turning back, only timing, and the certainty that the next encounter would end very differently. The main cafeteria at Alcatraz on October 23, 1959, was designed for control rather than comfort, a long rectangular room filled with rows of heavy wooden tables bolted to the floor, benches fixed in place, and clear sight lines intended to give guards visual dominance over nearly every inmate seated inside. Yet, despite that design, the space carried its own tension because it forced proximity, stripped away personal distance, and turned every interaction into a public performance. Guards were positioned along the perimeter, elevated slightly, watching for sudden movements, fights, or weapons, but they did not stand between inmates, and that meant the real dynamics of power unfolded at table level, in glances, posture, and language, rather than open violence. On that Friday at approximately 12:15 p.m., inmates filed in with their trays, sat at assigned tables, and began eating in relative quiet, following the rigid routine that governed every meal, and among them was Bumpy Johnson, who took his seat with 3 other inmates and ate calmly, showing no outward sign that anything unusual was about to happen. Eric Pollson entered the cafeteria moments later, collected his tray, and instead of walking to his assigned table as required, he deliberately changed direction, crossing the open floor and choosing to sit directly across from Bumpy, an unmistakable violation of custom that immediately drew attention from nearby tables. The choice was calculated because sitting at another man's table without invitation was itself a challenge, and doing so in full view of guards and inmates transformed the act into a public statement, daring both the institution and the prisoners to respond. Pollson set his tray down with force, leaned forward, and began speaking loudly enough for others to hear, filling the space with racial slurs and mockery, attacking not just Bumpy's identity but his reputation, his past, and his perceived authority inside the prison. Bumpy continued eating without looking up, maintaining the same measured pace, refusing to give Pollson the reaction he clearly wanted, and that silence only fueled Pollson's need to escalate, because bullies rely on response to validate their dominance. As his words grew sharper and more aggressive, Pollson leaned closer, pressing the insult further, asserting hierarchy, daring Bumpy to respond in a way that would justify punishment, while guards watched from a distance, alert but unmoving, because words alone did not violate rules. The escalation reached its peak when Pollson shifted his attention away from Bumpy and began shouting across the cafeteria at Robert Jackson, the young inmate he had assaulted the previous day, mocking his injuries, threatening to come over and hurt him again, and using language that made the threat unmistakably clear. That moment changed the atmosphere instantly, because now the harassment was no longer confined to one table, and the danger was no longer theoretical, as several inmates began to stir, some starting to rise from their seats before guards barked orders for everyone to remain seated. Jackson lowered his head, visibly shaken, while Pollson smiled, emboldened by the attention and the lack of immediate consequence, believing he had complete control of the room and of the situation. In that instant, the cafeteria became more than a dining hall. It became a stage where weeks of calculated provocation converged, where witnesses were everywhere, where threats were undeniable, and where the next move would define reputations permanently. The guards sensed the shift, but still hesitated, bound by procedure and uncertain who would move first, unaware that the moment Bumpy Johnson had been waiting for had finally arrived, and that what followed would unfold so quickly that the room would erupt before anyone had time to intervene. The moment Bumpy Johnson stood up, something in the cafeteria shifted so subtly that most men felt it before they understood it, because until then, Pollson had controlled the rhythm of the exchange with his voice, his size, and his insults. But the instant Bumpy rose from the bench, calmly, deliberately, the noise in the room seemed to thin, as if instinct told everyone that whatever happened next would be final. As Bumpy straightened, his right hand moved not hurriedly, but precisely to his waist, slipping beneath the loose fold of his prison shirt, a motion so smooth that many witnesses later said they didn't realize he had drawn a weapon until after the first scream, because what he pulled free was small, almost unremarkable in size, a sharpened piece of metal roughly 4 inches long, fashioned into a blade, and hidden so carefully that even routine searches had never found it. In that same heartbeat, Pollson finally understood that this was no longer a verbal confrontation, and he began to rise from his bench, his hands coming up instinctively, either to defend himself or to strike first. But reaction is always slower than intention, and Bumpy was already moving. Step 1. Bumpy closed the distance, circling the end of the table instead of climbing over it, covering the 8 feet between them in roughly 2 seconds. Not running, not charging, but advancing with controlled speed that left no time for hesitation. Step 2, as Pollson's weight shifted forward and his balance broke, Bumpy's arm came across in a horizontal arc from left to right, the blade slicing through flesh with surgical precision, opening Pollson's face from cheekbone to jaw, a 7-inch gash that split skin instantly and began pouring blood down his neck and chest before pain even registered. Pollson screamed, a raw sound of shock rather than understanding, his hands flying to his face as blood soaked his fingers, his body freezing in disbelief because nothing in his experience had prepared him for how fast dominance could evaporate. Step 3 came before anyone else could move, because Bumpy never paused, never recoiled, never hesitated to assess the damage, and his arm rose again in a diagonal motion, this time cutting upward across Pollson's face, the blade crossing the first wound and catching his right eye, slicing through lid and socket in one decisive stroke that destroyed the eye instantly. That was when Pollson collapsed backward, his legs tangling with the bench as he fell hard onto the cafeteria floor, screaming continuously now, a high, panicked sound that echoed through the room as blood spread beneath him and streamed through his hands as he tried desperately to hold together what could not be saved. The entire sequence lasted no more than 3 to 4 seconds, but the effect was overwhelming because the room erupted in chaos all at once, trays crashing, men diving under tables, guards shouting and blowing whistles as the illusion of control disintegrated in front of them. Within moments, 5 guards rushed toward Bumpy with weapons drawn, while others moved to Pollson, who was writhing on the floor, his uniform soaked red, his ruined eye beyond repair, and in the midst of that chaos, Bumpy did something that defined the act as much as the violence itself. He dropped the blade to the floor, raised his hands calmly, and allowed himself to be forced down and handcuffed without resistance, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged, as if the outcome had unfolded exactly as expected. As guards pulled him away, as medics rushed in, as Pollson continued screaming, Bumpy spoke once, clearly, loudly enough that everyone nearby heard him, a single sentence delivered without anger or triumph, but with certainty, directed not just at Pollson, but at the room itself. Touch that young brother again, call him one more racial slur, and next time you won't visit a doctor, you'll visit God. The words landed heavier than the blade ever could, because they explained the violence without justifying it, framed the attack as protection rather than rage, and transformed what witnesses had seen from a sudden outburst into a warning with unmistakable meaning. In those 3 seconds, Pollson lost an eye, lost his belief in invulnerability, and lost the power he had built through years of fear, while Bumpy Johnson, at 54 years old, proved that intelligence, timing, and absolute commitment to action could dismantle brute force faster than anyone could react. What made the moment unforgettable was not just the blood or the injury, but the clarity of it. The way every insult, shove, and humiliation from the previous week suddenly aligned into a single devastating conclusion that left no ambiguity about who had crossed the line, who had waited, and why the violence, once unleashed, never needed to happen again. In the immediate aftermath of the cafeteria attack, Eric Pollson was rushed to the prison hospital in critical condition, his face requiring extensive emergency surgery because the first slash had torn a deep 7-inch wound across his cheeks and jaw that demanded more than 100 stitches, while the second slash had destroyed his right eye completely, leaving doctors no choice but to remove what remained of it, a permanent injury that marked the end of his physical dominance and the beginning of a far deeper collapse. During the 2 weeks Pollson spent recovering under guard supervision, medical staff noted a striking change in his behavior because the man who had once moved through prison with loud confidence and open hostility now spoke rarely, avoided eye contact, and seemed withdrawn, as though the realization that his size and reputation had failed him had shattered something fundamental in his sense of self. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical wounds, because Pollson had built his identity around the belief that fear made him untouchable, and losing that belief so publicly, so quickly, left him hollowed out, reduced to silence in a place where silence usually meant vulnerability. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson was placed in solitary confinement, pending investigation, confined to a small cell where time slowed to a crawl. Yet even there he remained composed because he had anticipated this outcome and understood that the real judgment would be decided not by emotion but by testimony, Over the following 2 weeks, prison officials interviewed dozens of inmates and guards, and the narrative that emerged was not one of sudden violence, but of sustained provocation, with witness after witness describing Pollson's pattern of harassment, the stolen food, the shove in the showers, the public humiliation in the yard, and finally, the assault on Robert Jackson the day before the attack. Testimonies confirmed that Pollson had sat at Bumpy's table uninvited, used racial slurs repeatedly, and openly threatened Jackson across the cafeteria, transforming the incident from a spontaneous assault into a response to an escalating and well-documented threat. When Bumpy gave his statement, it was brief, consistent, and unemotional, explaining that he had defended himself and another inmate from a man who had been terrorizing black prisoners for weeks, that guards had failed to intervene, and that he had used only enough force to ensure the threat would stop. That clarity mattered because prison administrators were now trapped by their own inaction, knowing that adding years to Bumpy's sentence would require them to publicly deny a pattern of racist abuse they had quietly allowed to continue. Instead, they chose a compromise that spoke louder than any official statement, punishing Bumpy with 30 days in solitary confinement for possession of a weapon and assault, enough to uphold institutional rules, but stopping short of extending his sentence, an outcome that implicitly acknowledged that his actions, while violent, had been provoked. Pollson, once released from the hospital, was quietly transferred to another federal facility, a move that effectively admitted he was the problem, not the man who stopped him, and within Alcatraz the message was unmistakable. The fallout reshaped the prison's internal balance of power because Pollson never threatened another black inmate again. Guards became more cautious about ignoring harassment, and inmates understood that a line existed beyond which intimidation would be answered decisively. Though the administration never spoke openly about failure, their actions revealed it clearly because justice inside Alcatraz had not come from authority or policy, but from a man who understood the system well enough to force it to confront its own neglect, leaving scars that were carried not just on Pollson's face, but on the conscience of the prison itself. What happened in the Alcatraz cafeteria on October 23, 1959, did not end when the blood was cleaned from the floor or when Eric Pollson was wheeled out on a stretcher, because stories like that never stay confined to one room or one prison, and within weeks, the account of what Bumpy Johnson had done began traveling through the federal prison system, carried by transferred inmates, whispered between cell blocks, repeated in hushed tones during recreation, and slowly transforming into something larger than an incident, something closer to law. In prisons across America, men spoke about the patients first, about how Johnson endured days of humiliation without reacting, allowing a racist bully to grow reckless and confident because in a world governed by fear, patience itself became a weapon, and that lesson resonated deeply with inmates who understood how quickly impulsive violence destroyed lives, while strategic violence sometimes preserved them. For black inmates especially, the story carried a different weight because it was not just about one man standing up to another, but about dignity being defended in a system that often refused to defend it, about a predator who had terrorized the vulnerable being stopped permanently when authority failed, and about the idea that respect could still exist even behind bars. Robert Jackson, the young man whose assault marked the moral turning point, served the rest of his sentence quietly and was released in 1962, carrying with him a lesson he would later describe to family as life-changing, because for the first time he had seen someone risk punishment not for power or profit, but to protect another person who could not protect himself. Jackson rarely spoke publicly about prison, but he kept a newspaper clipping about Johnson's death years later, and when he passed away in the 1990s, his family found a handwritten note tucked beside it, thanking the man who had shown him that courage sometimes arrives without warning and without obligation. Eric Pollson, after being transferred to another facility, never recovered the persona he once relied on because the loss of his eye was only the visible damage, while the deeper injury was psychological, the realization that size, violence, and hatred had not made him untouchable, and that belief, once shattered, never fully returned. Years later, after his release, Pollson reportedly told acquaintances that he had learned too late that being feared was not the same as being powerful, and that underestimating a quiet man with nothing left to prove had been the most expensive mistake of his life. Bumpy Johnson, meanwhile, returned to the general population at Alcatraz after 30 days in solitary to find that the prison around him had changed. Because men who once tested boundaries now kept their distance, racial slurs fell silent in his presence, and even guards treated him with a cautious respect, understanding that he was not reckless, but capable, and that capability demanded acknowledgement. His reputation followed him for the remainder of his sentence and beyond, protecting not only himself but others, because racists understood that targeting black inmates could bring consequences they could not escape, and that deterrence reshaped daily life more effectively than any written rule ever had. When Johnson was released and returned to Harlem, the Alcatraz incident became part of his legend, retold alongside stories of gang wars and criminal empires. But those who truly understood it knew that the power of the story lay not in the violence itself, but in the precision of it, the timing, the restraint that came before, and the finality that followed. Inside prisons, the lesson endured long after the men involved were gone, evolving into a cautionary tale repeated to new generations, warning bullies that patience could be deadlier than rage, that intelligence could dismantle brute force, and that the quietest man in the room might be the most dangerous if pushed far enough. What made the story endure was its clarity, because there was no confusion about why it happened, no ambiguity about who had crossed the line, and no doubt about the outcome. And in environments built on uncertainty and fear, clarity becomes its own form of authority. In the end, the legacy of that day was not the loss of an eye or the spilling of blood, but the reminder that power is not measured by size or noise, but by the ability to wait, to observe, and to act decisively when the moment demands it. And that lesson, forged in 3 seconds of violence, became an unwritten rule that echoed through prisons for decades, proving that patience, power, and precision applied together can end a threat more completely than endless aggression ever could.